What started as viral clips turned into a full-blown internet split. E.J. Johnson's identity, D.L. Hughley's blunt comments, and Katt Williams' theories didn't just spark debate, they triggered something bigger. And now, with Magic Johnson silently in the center of it all, one question is dominating everything. Are people just seeing self-expression, or is there a deeper story no one is openly talking about? What started as a few viral clips didn't just spark a debate, it ignited a full-blown internet split. And suddenly, everyone had an opinion, whether informed or not. Because at the center of it all was E.J. Johnson, and a conversation that quickly stopped being about fashion, fame, or celebrity presence, and started becoming something far more sensitive, far more complicated, and far more polarizing. It began with resurfaced interviews and clips circulating online, where E.J. spoke openly about identity, self-expression, and rejecting the idea of being boxed into one fixed label. For some viewers, it came across as confidence, someone refusing to be limited by categories like gay, trans, or even non-binary, instead choosing to define themselves on their own terms. But for others watching the same clips, it created confusion. Not because identity itself is new, but because the way it was being described didn't fit neatly into the labels people are used to understanding. And on the internet, anything that challenges clarity usually turns into debate. That's where things escalated. Online commentary began splitting into two loud camps. One side praised the idea of fluid identity and self-definition without restriction. The other side questioned the contradictions they felt they were hearing, arguing that when labels are removed entirely, communication starts to break down instead of becoming clearer. And once that tension formed, it didn't stay quiet for long. Because now, public figures were pulled into it. Clips of D.L. Hughley began circulating, where he addressed the broader cultural conversation in a blunt, no-filter way. His point wasn't subtle. He emphasized that personal identity may be flexible in language, but biology and physical reality don't simply disappear because terminology changes. That statement alone was enough to send social media into overdrive. Supporters called it honesty, critics called it insensitive, and within hours the clip was everywhere. But the situation didn't stop there. Katt Williams soon entered the conversation in his own unpredictable way, shifting the tone completely. Instead of treating it as a simple cultural disagreement, he hinted at something deeper, suggesting that what people were seeing wasn't just individual expression, but part of a larger entertainment system where image, influence, and narrative are constantly shaped behind the scenes. That's when the internet stopped treating it as just a discussion. Now it was a theory, a narrative, a web of connections people were trying to piece together in real time. And somehow it all started circling back to one unavoidable name, Magic Johnson. Not because he was actively involved in the debate, but because E.J. Johnson is his son. And in celebrity culture, family connections are never private for long. Before all of this controversy, E.J. was already known in a completely different light. Fashion-forward, confident, highly visible in entertainment spaces, and unapologetically expressive in the way he presented himself. Red carpets, reality television appearances, luxury events. He wasn't trying to blend in, and that alone made him a consistent topic of conversation. But that visibility also came with constant comparison. Because Magic Johnson represents something entirely different in public perception. Discipline, athletic dominance, traditional masculinity, business success, a global sports icon whose legacy was built in an entirely different world. So when E.J. stepped into the spotlight with an identity and presence that challenged traditional expectations, people didn't just notice the difference, they turned it into a narrative. And over time, that narrative grew louder than the person at the center of it. Every interview E.J. gave, every appearance, Every statement about identity and self-expression became fuel for interpretation. Some viewers saw empowerment, someone living openly without apology. Others saw contradiction, trying to reconcile statements that didn't fit neatly into familiar categories. And then came the comments that pushed the conversation even further into controversy. Claims about attraction, perception, and how identity is interpreted in social spaces. Those statements, whether taken literally or out of context online, became viral talking points that spread faster than the original interviews themselves. At that point, the discussion stopped being just about EJ. It became about society itself, how people define identity, how attraction is understood, and how quickly public opinion can shift when clarity disappears and interpretation takes over. Meanwhile, every appearance EJ made only intensified the spotlight. Fashion shows, celebrity events, global attention. Each moment added another layer to a story that was no longer controlled by a single person. And through all of it, the same question kept resurfacing in interviews and online commentary. What does Magic Johnson think? Publicly, he remained largely composed, rarely engaging in the noise surrounding the conversation. But the internet doesn't wait for answers. It fills silence with speculation. And in that silence, assumptions tend to grow louder than facts. So what started as a few resurfaced clips turned into something much larger. A cultural debate about identity, a media storm about interpretation, and a viral cycle where every new comment only deepened the divide instead of resolving it. Because in the end, this was never just about one person's statements. It became a reflection of how quickly the internet transforms personal expression into public controversy, and how fast context disappears once a story goes viral. What started as a simple clip online didn't just spark conversation. It created a split in perception that kept widening the more people watched it. Because when Magic Johnson entered the picture, the internet didn't just see a father supporting his child. On the surface, that's exactly what it looked like: steady, composed, saying all the expected things about love, acceptance, and family. The kind of response you'd assume from someone who understands public pressure better than most. But online, nothing stays surface level for long. People began replaying interviews not for what was said, but how it was said. The pauses between sentences, the careful wording, the way certain questions seemed to shift the energy in the room. Small details that in isolation wouldn't mean much, but in the age of constant replay and analysis, they started forming patterns in people's minds. And that's where the conversation changed direction. Support started being questioned, not as absence of love, but as something more controlled, more calculated. People began asking whether this was full alignment or careful navigation of public image in a situation where every word carries weight. Because Magic Johnson isn't just a public figure, he's a global brand, a business empire, a legacy built over decades. And in that position, even personal moments become public risk management. Every statement has consequences. Every reaction gets dissected. So now, what looked simple on the outside started feeling more layered on the inside. At the same time, the broader conversation around EJ Johnson was already escalating. Clips resurfaced, interviews were reanalyzed, statements about identity, fluidity, rejection of labels, refusal to be boxed in started circulating again, but this time with louder commentary attached. Some saw it as confidence and freedom. Others saw contradiction and confusion. And once those two interpretations clashed, the internet did what it always does. It turned opinion into debate. Then came the outside voices. D.L. Hughley stepped in first, cutting through the noise with a blunt, no-filter perspective. He didn't try to soften it. He didn't try to balance both sides. He simply pointed out what he saw as biological reality versus personal expression, and that alone was enough to ignite a wave of reactions. For some, it was honesty. For others, it was dismissive. But either way, it forced the conversation into a sharper, more divided space. And just when it felt like the discussion couldn't get more intense, Katt Williams entered and changed the tone completely. Unlike everyone else reacting to the surface, Katt zoomed out. He wasn't just talking about EJ anymore. He started talking about systems, patterns, structures behind celebrity culture that most people don't see until they're already inside it. And that's when the conversation shifted from identity to influence. He suggested that Hollywood doesn't just reflect public narratives, it helps shape them. That image, perception, and controversy are sometimes not accidents, but part of a cycle that keeps attention moving and keeps figures relevant. Whether people agree with that or not, the idea itself was enough to send the internet into overdrive. Because now people weren't just analyzing EJ anymore. They were analyzing everything around EJ. And somehow, that brought Magic Johnson back into focus. Not because he said anything new, but because silence, wording, and presence were now being interpreted differently. People started rewatching old interviews, looking for micro-expressions, tone shifts, hesitation. Moments that previously meant nothing were suddenly being treated like clues. The internet began splitting again. One group said it's simple, a father supporting his child in a complicated public world, nothing more. Another group pushed a different idea, that what looks like natural support might also be shaped by pressure, public expectations, brand protection, and the reality of being a legacy figure under constant scrutiny. And once that idea entered the conversation, it didn't stay contained. It spread outward. Now people weren't just talking about Magic and EJ. They started comparing similar dynamics across celebrity families, different names, different situations, but the same recurring themes. Identity, public perception, family visibility, and the pressure of living under constant observation. And that's where the debate stopped being about individuals. It became about patterns. Some called it growth, society becoming more open, more expressive, more complex in how identity is understood. Others called it something else entirely: confusion, narrative pressure, or the cost of living life permanently in public view. And the most unsettling part of all of it, nobody could agree on which interpretation was real. Because the deeper people looked, the less simple anything seemed. Every answer created another question. Every explanation created another angle. And every clip added another layer to a conversation that was no longer about one person, but about how the internet turns personal lives into public theories in real time. They zoomed out again, and this time the picture that came into view didn't calm the conversation. It made it heavier. Because what people started noticing wasn't just one situation, or one family, or one public moment. It was repetition, patterns, similar headlines appearing again and again across different celebrity households, different names, different timelines, but somehow the same kind of public reaction every time. Kids of powerful figures stepping into identities that immediately trigger national-level discussion. Parents responding in near-identical ways, careful language, controlled statements, measured support, always staying just within the boundaries of what can be said publicly without igniting something bigger. And at first, many people pushed back hard against the idea of a pattern. They said it plainly: this is just society changing. More openness, more visibility, more people feeling safe enough to express who they are without hiding it. To them, there was nothing unusual happening at all. Just a generation growing up in a different world than the one before it. But not everyone accepted that explanation so easily. Because others started asking a different set of questions, not emotional ones, but observational ones. Why does it seem more concentrated in celebrity environments? Why do these situations always end up public instead of private? And why do the responses from high-profile parents feel so familiar, almost rehearsed in tone, even when the situations are completely different. That's where the conversation started shifting again. And right when it reached that point, an older idea resurfaced, one originally tied to Katt Williams' broader commentary about Hollywood and image. Not just influence, but transformation. The suggestion that in entertainment, identity and image are not always static, that sometimes public figures go through controlled evolutions, phases where how they are seen by the world changes dramatically, sometimes suddenly, sometimes strategically, depending on what direction their public narrative is moving. And once that idea re-entered the discussion, everything became more complicated. Because now people weren't just looking at individuals anymore. They were looking at cycles. According to this perspective, the entertainment industry doesn't just respond to change, it packages it, amplifies it, and in some cases, reshapes it into something the public can engage with, debate, and consume. Not everyone agreed with that interpretation. In fact, most people rejected it outright. But the internet doesn't need universal agreement to keep a theory alive. It only needs curiosity. And curiosity was already everywhere. People began pulling examples into the conversation, stacking them side by side, comparing reactions, tone, timing, and public responses across different celebrity families. Dwayne Wade, and how openly he supports his family's identity choices. Marlon Wayans, and the way he speaks about these topics with humor layered over seriousness, like someone still processing how public the conversation has become. Eddie Murphy, and how carefully he avoids certain discussions entirely, choosing distance over commentary. Different personalities, different approaches, but to online audiences, they all started to feel connected by something invisible. Not identical stories, but similar pressure points. And once people started seeing those connections, they became harder to unsee. Because now it wasn't just about one household anymore. It was about a recurring structure, how celebrity families navigate identity, public scrutiny, and constant media interpretation at the same time. And right at the center of all this attention remained Magic Johnson, a man whose public image had been built over decades with precision, discipline, leadership, composure, success. A figure who has always been extremely controlled in how he presents himself to the world. But now, that control was being examined in a completely different context. Not as an athlete, not as a businessman, but as a father under a microscope. Every interview clip began getting replayed with new intent. Not to hear the answers, but to analyze how they were delivered. The pauses between words, the slight shifts in expression, the careful way certain topics were addressed and others avoided entirely. And slowly, what once looked like simple public support began being reinterpreted by some viewers as something more complex. Not necessarily conflict, but navigation. A balancing act between personal life and public image, where every word carries multiple consequences at once. Because Magic Johnson doesn't operate in a normal public space. He exists at a level where personal reputation, business identity, and global legacy are all connected. One wrong interpretation in the media can echo across all three. So when people say he is careful, they're not wrong. But what that care means depends entirely on who is watching. For some, it looks like stability, strength, a father protecting both his child and his family from unnecessary public escalation. For others, it looks more complicated than that, like someone aware that silence, tone, and phrasing can all be interpreted in different ways depending on the narrative already forming online. And that's where the split really begins. Because in one version of the story, everything is simple, unconditional support, no hidden meaning, just family loyalty in a difficult public environment. But in another version, nothing is simple at all. Every statement becomes layered. Every appearance becomes analyzed. Every reaction becomes part of a larger interpretation, whether intended or not. And once those two perspectives exist at the same time, they don't cancel each other out. They compete. That competition intensified when public commentary entered the conversation again, especially from figures like D.L. Hughley and Katt Williams. D.L. Hughley's contribution was direct and grounded. He framed the discussion in terms of clarity versus interpretation, emphasizing that personal identity and public perception often collide, but that physical reality and language still matter in how people communicate and understand each other. To some viewers, that sounded like straightforward honesty. To others, it sounded like a refusal to engage with evolving language around identity. And that disagreement alone was enough to split audiences further. Then Katt Williams stepped in again, but in a different way. Not focused on individuals alone, but on structure. On how narratives move through entertainment spaces. On how attention shifts. On how certain stories rise, fade, and return again at different times with renewed intensity. His perspective wasn't presented as a direct claim about any single person. It was more abstract. But abstraction is exactly what allows interpretation to expand in multiple directions. And expand it did. Because now the conversation wasn't just about E.J. Johnson anymore. It was about systems. And once systems enter the discussion, individuals stop being seen in isolation. They become examples, whether fairly or not. That's when Magic Johnson's name became unavoidable again. Not because he changed anything he said or did, but because the internet began reevaluating everything he had already said through a different lens. Old interviews resurfaced. Public appearances were slowed down and rewatched. Body language became a topic of discussion. Tone became evidence, and silence became meaning. A single supportive statement in one interview could now be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the viewer's perspective. That's how the narrative expanded beyond control. And that's where the discomfort started for many observers. Because at some point, people stopped debating just EJ's identity or Magic's response. They started debating interpretation itself. What counts as support? What counts as contradiction? What counts as clarity? And what happens when all of those definitions start to blur at the same time? Online, the divide grew sharper. One side insisted the situation was being overcomplicated, that what people were seeing was exactly what it appeared to be. A father supporting a child in a world that constantly misreads private lives as public content. The other side argued that nothing in modern celebrity culture is ever that simple, that image management, media framing, and public expectation all shape how situations are presented and understood, whether intentionally or not. And neither side could fully convince the other, because both interpretations had enough surface-level evidence to feel believable, even if neither could be proven in full. That's what made the conversation so unstable. It wasn't one clear story being debated. It was multiple, overlapping stories being interpreted at once. And as more voices entered the discussion, commentators, podcast hosts, influencers, media analysts, the noise only grew louder. Some tried to bring balance, acknowledging that identity discussions are deeply personal, while also recognizing that public figures inevitably face scrutiny. And why? Others leaned into the idea that Hollywood narratives are never fully organic, that visibility, controversy, and timing often work together in ways the audience doesn't fully see. Whether people agreed or rejected that idea didn't matter as much as the fact that it kept the conversation alive. Because once suspicion, curiosity, and interpretation enter the same space, the story stops being fixed. It keeps evolving. And by this point, the focus had clearly shifted. It was no longer just about E.J. Johnson. It was no longer just about Magic Johnson. It was no longer even just about commentary from public figures. It had become something broader, about how modern fame works, how narratives form, and how quickly personal lives can become public frameworks for debate, interpretation, and projection. And just when it felt like the conversation had reached its peak intensity, the public reaction poured in again, bigger, louder, more divided than before. Because now, everyone wasn't just reacting to what was happening. They were reacting to what they thought it meant. And in that space between fact and interpretation, the story stopped belonging to one person. It became something the internet itself was now trying to define. At this point, the conversation stopped being about who was right or wrong. It became something else entirely: perception. Because two people can watch the exact same interview, hear the exact same words, and walk away with completely different realities in their heads. One sees love. The other sees pressure. One sees acceptance. The other sees restraint. And the problem is, neither side can fully prove what they believe. That's what makes this situation so powerful and so unstable. Because it exists in that gray space where facts end and interpretation takes over. And once a story enters that space, it stops belonging to one person. It starts belonging to everyone watching. As the debate grew louder online, mainstream media picked it up again. And just like the internet, they didn't tell one version of the story, they told many. Some headlines focused on identity and self-expression, framing it as a modern conversation about freedom, individuality, and breaking labels. Others leaned into controversy, highlighting backlash, disagreement, and public tension. Same story, different angles, completely different emotional impact depending on where you read it. And with every repost, every clip, every reaction video, the audience didn't shrink, it expanded. More people entered the conversation who hadn't even seen the original interviews. More opinions formed. More sides emerged. More certainty, built on less and less direct information. And then something strange started happening. The conversation stopped being just about E.J. Johnson. It stopped being just about Magic Johnson. It stopped even being about Katt Williams or D.L. Hughley. It started turning inward. People weren't just debating public figures anymore. They were debating themselves. Their beliefs. Their assumptions. Their definitions of identity, truth, and authenticity. And that's when a story stops being entertainment. That's when it becomes something heavier. Something that forces reflection, whether people want it or not. But here's the part nobody can ignore. No matter which side people take, no matter what they believe, they're still watching, still commenting, still refreshing updates, still waiting for the next development. And that means one thing very clearly. This story is not finished, not even close. Because in situations like this, silence doesn't end the conversation. It extends it. And right now, one thing is standing out more than anything else. Not what's being said, but what is. Because for all the viral clips, all the commentary, all the analysis, there's one missing piece that keeps getting louder by its absence. A direct response from the two central figures at the heart of it all. E.J. Johnson and Magic Johnson. And that silence, it didn't calm things down. It intensified everything. Because when people don't get answers, they don't stop asking questions. They start creating their own. Some believe the silence is intentional, strategic, a way to avoid feeding a cycle that only grows when engaged. In that view, saying nothing is the smartest move possible, because in today's media world, Even a simple sentence can be turned into a headline that spirals out of control. But others don't see strategy. They see pressure. They see something building behind the scene that hasn't been spoken yet. Because when a situation reaches this level, viral, emotional, heavily discussed across platforms, silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling loaded, like something is being managed, controlled, contained. And that's when a new question starts circulating. What happens if that control breaks? Because no narrative stays locked forever. At some point, something shifts. A moment of honesty, a slip in wording, a question answered too directly, a reaction that wasn't carefully polished. And in this kind of story, even a small moment like that doesn't stay small for long. It rewrites everything. Now imagine it for a second. Magic Johnson in a long-form interview. Not rehearsed sound bites, not carefully framed questions, but real, uninterrupted conversation. And one question hits differently. Not about basketball, not about legacy, but about everything surrounding this conversation. What happens if he pauses? What happens if his answer doesn't perfectly align with previous statements? What happens if, for just a moment, the polished public image shows something more human underneath? That single moment would be enough to shift how people interpret everything that came before it. Because suddenly, theories would feel less like speculation and more like reinterpretation. And then there's EJ, who until now has remained mostly defined through clips, appearances, and second-hand commentary. Controlled visibility, curated moments, selective statements that leave room for interpretation. But what happens if that changes? What happens if EJ speaks directly, not in fragments, not in vague commentary, but clearly, specifically, addressing every claim, every assumption, every contradiction people online have built narratives around? That wouldn't just continue the conversation. It would reset it. Because now there would be no gaps left for interpretation to fill. Or at least less room than before. But there's another possibility. And it might be the most unpredictable of all. What if neither of them speaks? What if the silence continues? On the surface, that sounds like the safest path. No escalation. No controversy. No new headlines. But in reality, silence in a viral moment doesn't close a story. It expands it. Because silence creates space. And in that space, people fill in their own meanings, their own theories, their own versions of what might be happening behind the scenes. And once that begins, it doesn't slow down, it multiplies. One group continues to see this as a story about identity and self-expression. Another group continues to believe there is something deeper at play, something not fully visible to the public. And without a clear resolution, both interpretations grow at the same time. That's what makes this situation different from a typical viral moment. There is no final statement, no clean explanation, no agreed-upon conclusion. Instead, it keeps evolving, shifting every time a new clip surfaces, every time an old interview gets rewatched, every time a new voice enters the conversation. And that's why this feels less like a story and more like a cycle of attention, interpretation, reaction, and reinterpretation again. Because the moment people think they understand it, something else enters the conversation and changes the angle completely. And now everything is sitting at a breaking point. One interview, one response, one unexpected moment of clarity or contradiction. That's all it would take to shift the entire narrative again. So the real question is what people think anymore. It's what happens next. Will someone finally speak and close the gap between perception and reality? Will silence continue and allow the internet to keep building its own versions of the story? Or are we still only in the opening chapter of something much larger than anyone realized? Because if this situation has proven anything so far, it's this. The moment it feels understood, it changes again. And now the only thing left is the question being asked everywhere, even if nobody agrees on the answer. What is really going on here, and who gets to define it when the world is watching?